It is the summer of 1692, and a small Puritan village in Massachusetts gathers under the rising sun, the air heavy with dread and whispers, as men, women, and children stand at Gallows Hill, watching the condemned march forward in chains, their hands bound, their faces pale yet defiant, some whispering prayers, others gasping in disbelief, as the hangman prepares his ropes. The crowd is silent, except for the afflicted girls crying out in fits, claiming they see spectral forms hovering above the condemned. And though many in the audience doubt, no one dares to speak, for fear that the finger of accusation might suddenly turn upon them. And so they watch as the trapdoors fall, bodies drop, and life is extinguished. And thus begins one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history, the Salem Witch Trials. To understand how a village came to murder its own neighbors, we must step into the world of 17th century Puritan New England, a harsh, unforgiving place where faith dictated every breath, where ministers preached that Satan was a constant presence seeking to corrupt the godly, where crop failures, sudden illness, or death of livestock were not seen as chance, but as evidence of the devil's hand, where conformity was demanded, dissent was punished, and survival itself was precarious in the face of brutal winters, famine, and war on the frontiers. Salem was already divided, Salem town prospering as a merchant port, while Salem village, poorer and agricultural, resented its dependence, its people fractured by quarrels over land, church leadership, and politics. At the center stood Reverend Parris, a stern and controversial minister whose sermons often railed about Satan walking in their midst. A man deeply unpopular, but entrenched in the village's disputes. It was in his household that the spark was struck. In January 1692, his 9-year-old daughter Betty and his 11-year-old niece Abigail Williams began to suffer violent fits, shrieking, barking, contorting their bodies in unnatural ways, symptoms the village doctor could not explain. And soon, other young girls, Ann Putnam Jr., Mercy Lewis, Elizabeth Hubbard, and Mary Walcott, began to display similar torments, claiming invisible spirits pinched and choked them. Their bodies thrown into convulsions, their voices crying out that witches tormented them. In a culture where invisible forces were believed real, the explanation seemed obvious: witchcraft. Under pressure to name their tormentors, the girls pointed first to 3 women on the margins of society. Sarah Good, a destitute beggar who muttered under her breath when refused charity. Sarah Osborne, an elderly woman who had scandalized the village by living with a man out of wedlock and contesting inheritance law. And Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean in Reverend Parris's household, who had told the children stories of spirits and divination. Arrest warrants were issued, and the women dragged before magistrates Jonathan Corwin and John Hathorne. The examinations were scenes of chaos. The afflicted girls screamed and writhed on the floor as the women entered, crying out that their specters tormented them. Sarah Good denied the charges fiercely. Sarah Osborne weakly resisted. But Tituba, after brutal questioning and likely beating, confessed, claiming she served the devil, describing a great black man, animals, and witches flying on poles, even naming others whose names she had seen in the devil's book. Her confession confirmed the villagers' worst fears. There was not just one witch, but a vast conspiracy against Salem. Panic erupted, and accusations spread like wildfire. Dozens of townspeople were accused, from outspoken women to respected church members. Old feuds re-emerged. Neighbors weaponized accusations to settle land disputes and personal grudges. The jails overflowed with the accused, shackled in freezing conditions, some with infants at their breasts, others elderly and infirm, all awaiting trial in terror. By May, Governor William Phips established a special tribunal, the Court of Oyer and Terminer, presided over by Chief Justice William Stoughton, empowered to try and sentence suspected witches. The court permitted spectral evidence, claims that the ghost or spirit of the accused had harmed someone, even if their physical body was elsewhere. To modern ears, it is absurd, but in Puritan Salem, it carried weight. For how else could Satan work except through invisible means? Trials followed a grim, predictable rhythm. The accused were brought in. The afflicted girls collapsed in violent fits. Witnesses recounted dreams and unexplained misfortunes. Witch marks were searched for on their bodies, and the judges pressed for confessions. To confess often meant saving one's life, though it also required naming other witches, spreading the net wider. To refuse meant almost certain death. The first to be tried was Bridget Bishop, a woman in her 60s, twice widowed, outspoken, owner of an orchard and tavern, known for wearing red and bright clothing, behavior deemed scandalous. Witnesses claimed her specter pinched them, that her cider house hosted sinful gatherings, that she bewitched livestock. She denied it all, but on June 2nd, she was found guilty, and on June 10th, 1692, she was hanged on Gallows Hill, the first victim of the Salem executions. More followed quickly. Sarah Good, defiant to the end, cursed her executioner on July 19th, proclaiming he would have blood to drink. Indeed, years later, Sheriff George Corwin died of a sudden hemorrhage, choking on his own blood. Rebecca Nurse, a 71-year-old grandmother beloved in the community, was accused by the Putnam family, with whom her family feuded. Her initial acquittal brought hope, but when the afflicted girls erupted in fits at the verdict, judges pressed the jury to reconsider. She was condemned and executed, her dignity intact, as she proclaimed her innocence with her final breath. Martha Carrier, outspoken and sharp-tongued, was accused of being the Queen of Hell, her children forced to testify against her under pressure. She too was hanged. Even ministers were not safe. George Burroughs, once pastor of Salem Village, was accused of leading the witches' coven, charged with feats of unnatural strength, like lifting muskets with one hand. On the gallows, Burroughs stunned the crowd by reciting the Lord's Prayer flawlessly, something thought impossible for a witch. Many gasped, believing his innocence, but Judge Stoughton pressed the execution forward. He was hanged, his words echoing among the crowd. Then came Giles Corey, an elderly farmer, accused alongside his wife Martha. Refusing to enter a plea, knowing conviction was inevitable, Corey stayed silent. Without a plea, the court could not proceed, and so he was pressed to death under heavy stones. For 2 days he endured the crushing weight, refusing to yield, his final words recorded as "more weight." He died on September 19, 1692, the only man in American history executed by pressing. As summer turned to fall, the executions mounted. 19 hanged, 1 pressed, hundreds still accused. Even animals were not spared. 2 dogs executed for witchcraft. But doubts began to grow. Increase Mather, president of Harvard, spoke against spectral evidence, declaring it better for 10 witches to escape than for one innocent to die. Some jurors and ministers questioned the court's methods. The hysteria reached a breaking point when the governor's own wife, Lady Mary Phipps, was accused. Suddenly, the fire had burned too close to power. On October 29th, Governor Phipps dissolved the Court of Oyer and Terminer, halting the executions. A new court formed in early 1693 rejected spectral evidence, and many accused were released. Yet the damage was irreversible. In total, more than 200 people were accused, 30 found guilty, 20 executed, and at least 5 died in prison, awaiting trial. Families of the condemned were left destitute, their land seized, their names shamed. Children grew up orphaned, branded with suspicion. For years, shame haunted the colony. In 1697, a day of fasting and repentance was declared. Judges and jurors signed petitions of sorrow. Samuel Sewell, one of the judges, stood in his church and publicly confessed guilt for his role. Reverend Samuel Parris, facing outrage, was forced from his pulpit. In 1711, restitution was granted to some families, though never enough to heal the wound. In 1957, more than 2.5 centuries later, Massachusetts formally apologized for the tragedy. Today in Salem, memorials mark the names of the executed, granite benches bearing each victim's name, where visitors still leave flowers and notes, a quiet testimony that these innocents are not forgotten. The Salem Witch Trials were never truly about witches. They were about fear and power, about the dangerous collision of superstition, personal vendettas, and unchecked authority. They remind us how easily a society can descend into madness when justice bows to hysteria. In Salem, neighbors turned on neighbors, children condemned adults, and the courts abandoned reason. The victims died not for crimes, but for being different, for being vulnerable, for being caught in a storm of fear. And so the question lingers: what happens when fear outweighs truth? When the voices of reason are silenced? When the innocent are sacrificed to satisfy the mob? Salem's echo warns us still that the darkest crimes are not always committed in secret shadows, but in the open, in broad daylight, sanctioned by the crowd, and justified by those who believe they are doing God's work, when in truth they are destroying their own.